Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
I was just exercising. I taped 20-minute workout on my machine and played it back at high speed, so it only took 10 minutes. I got a great workout.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Brian Auten.
And I'm Chad Gross.
And we're looking forward to today's interview with Lydia McGrew.
Indeed. Dr. Lydia McGrew is a widely published analytical philosopher and author. She received her PhD in English from Vanderbilt University in 1995. She has published extensively in the theory of knowledge, specializing in formal epistemology and in its application to the evaluation of testimony and to the philosophy of religion. She defends the reliability of the Gospels and Acts in 4 books to date, most recently Testimonies to the Truth, Why You Can Trust the Gospels, which we'll be focusing on today. For links to previous interviews with Lydia that we've done, check out the links provided in the show notes.
So the book Testimonies to the Truth, Why You Can Trust the Gospels is broken into 8 chapters, and it's building a cumulative case for their reliability. It's also a very helpful resource because it's formatted with study questions for reflection and thinking more carefully about it. She looks at things like locations, customs, culture, undesigned coincidences, unnecessary details, unexplained allusions, unexpected harmonies, and unified personalities within the 4 Gospels. And in the final chapter, she looks at the unmistakable Jesus. So be sure to check the show notes for links to the other books, and we'll get ready for the interview.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
Well, Lydia McGrew, thanks for joining us again for the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Well, this is our 3rd podcast now, and I'm enjoying all the things we've been talking about. And, we talked about gospel reliability of John. We talked about the maximal data case for the resurrection. So today we'll be talking about content that you cover in your newest book, which is Testimonies to the Truth, Why You Can Trust the Gospels. Really enjoyable read, and I think it's a great resource. Would you say this is sort of like a culmination of all the different research and work you've been doing with New Testament, evaluating testimony and things like that?
Well, I would say it's trying to take all of that and put it into a form that's really friendly for the layman and for use in like Bible study groups, small Sunday school study groups, and that kind of thing. So there's going to be even more detail on some of these things in my earlier books, especially The Mirror, the Mask, and The Eye of the Beholder. And I give passages like that as further resources for further study if people are interested. But here what I'm doing is I'm trying to take it and put it in a very user-friendly form so that someone can just pick it up and doesn't have to feel daunted by the length or anything of that kind, but they can get a sample of all these different arguments as he goes through the different chapters.
Yeah, it's really well formatted in that regards. Each chapter has the study questions and things to reflect on. And even if you don't use it in a group study, reading through those questions refreshes your mind and makes you think. So it is really user-friendly in that sense. So a great resource.
Thanks. I'm hoping a lot of people will use it for that purpose and order, a box of them, not just one from the publisher,
Good sort of small group study sort of thing would be great. So, well, you're a philosopher and you specialize in epistemology or like theory of knowledge. How do we know things? And we've talked about this briefly on some of our other podcasts or interviews, but for people who haven't listened to those, maybe if you kind of address that aspect of how that informs your approach in looking at the reliability of the Gospels as true historical accounts.
One thing that I find that my background as a philosopher does is to teach me to zero in on the question, what does this mean when I'm reading what someone has to say about the Gospels? So if someone says, John feels free to adapt Jesus' words, to take an example, something you might find in biblical criticism, a philosopher will say, give me a concrete example of what you mean. How far does that go? What does that really amount to? Is that something trivial? Is that something controversial, etc.? And then we can evaluate it. Whereas sometimes scholars in the humanities, they tend to speak in these very broad, vague terms. And an analytic philosopher doesn't like vagueness. We're supposed to be clear. So that's one thing. Another thing it does is that it gives me a kind of sociological independence, a social independence from the field. So if somebody says to me, well, a lot of scholars disagree with you. I can say, oh, well, I mean, that doesn't necessarily overawe me or make me say, I must be wrong. I want to know what their arguments are. What are their reasons? What specifically do they disagree with? Have they understood my position correctly? And then what's their argument for their position? And it's all about the arguments. Whereas when you're actually within the field, then you're a little more subject to those kinds of social pressures. And then a third thing I would mention is that it's made me sensitive to the issue of complexity in hypotheses and ad hocness, and sort of adding all of these auxiliaries, these extra bells and whistles to your hypothesis to make it work. And that's a very important sensitivity to bring, because a lot of times when scholars will approach the Gospels, they may not even realize it, but they're approaching them as if they're assuming that they're literary creations, at least in part. And then the only question is, how or where are they literary creations? Whereas if you don't approach it with that assumption, then you can zero right in on that and say, it's awfully complicated that you're assuming that this person included or you're saying this person included a reference to green grass to symbolize Psalm 23. It doesn't look like he's saying anything about Psalm 23. It looks like he's just saying that on that day the grass was green. And so you can notice these unstated complexities that are coming in, and an epistemologist is really concerned about over-complexity in hypotheses.
It seems, too, like in a way, sometimes if you're talking about studies or things, they will have studies and then they'll have meta-analyses of all these studies. And it's like, okay, how have all these studies been carried out, and what do we see from a different outside perspective when we're looking at all of them together? And in that sense, I think that coming at it from a philosopher's point of view, your awareness of presuppositions, of, as you say, certain complexities of and how we justify things, that's got to be helpful to over and against someone who's in the field, just swimming in the water, doesn't realize their presuppositions because they're just believing the way everyone else believes or assuming the things everyone else assumes. So I think that outside perspective should be welcomed in the sense of you're bringing a different tool set to it that sheds light on things that people are ignoring.
So Lydia, is it welcomed?
It hasn't been. No, not very much so. In fact, I've gotten the distinct feeling that there's this notion that, there's something I don't know, or that I just don't understand, something that's completely obvious to anyone within the field. And repeatedly, I've had to say, no, I'm aware of that. I just disagree with it, and here's why, And so, no, it hasn't always been welcomed, unfortunately. You were talking about studies and coming to them from outside. Of course, as you know, in the sciences, there's this, what they call the reproducibility crisis, where they haven't been able to reproduce certain results and so forth. I think, in a sense, New Testament has its own version of that reproducibility crisis, because people don't realize that they're really cherry-picking their data. So, for example, if they want to say there's been a development in some area, right? Like the Christology of the Gospels gets gradually higher and higher. But then if you picked different data points, it wouldn't look like that anymore, And so they don't even realize that they're doing the equivalent of what is known in the sciences as p-hacking, which is where you're going in there and you're just picking your data points to make it come out the way that you assumed it would come out, and then you could say, aha, we got a statistically significant outcome, and somebody else could come along and do it a different way and come up with a completely different outcome. So it's good to be able to come at that and say, wait a minute, what about this over here where it looks like there's a bit of high Christology in Mark, even though he's the earliest gospel or something like that, to bring up counter examples. And I think that outsider perspective is good for that purpose.
Even though you're coming from an outside perspective, interestingly enough, some of the data you're bringing to, say, a case for the reliability of the Gospels is nothing new. It's sort of the tagline of your podcast is you're making common sense rigorous. Certain things that should be obvious if you were just allowing the text to speak for itself, you'd say, okay, yeah, this has the ring of truth, but if you explore why it has that ring of truth, well, here are all the reasons, and you're sort of like distilling those or drawing them out of the actual text, which, as I say, it's nothing new. It's drawing on a lot of work that's been done in the past.
Right. Well, sometimes in the 19th century. And this is where I find that the humanities tend to have what I call science envy. So there will be this notion that just as science discovers, say, new quarks or new laws that we didn't know before, or maybe even a whole new planet or something that we didn't know about, that biblical studies is the same way. And so now we just, quote unquote, know things that, let's say, William Paley in the late 1700s or J.J. Blunt in the mid-1800s, they just didn't know. We've just discovered something that they didn't know before. And really, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way in English literature. It doesn't work that way in biblical studies. It doesn't work that way in education theory, heaven knows, where just as time goes on, we just discover some brand new thing and it sweeps everything from before, it sweeps it all away. So that's why this stuff would be looked down on sometimes. In fact, when Tim debated Bart Ehrman some years ago, I believe literally at one point in the Unbelievable show, Ehrman said, this sounds like some kind of 19th century thing. And I mean, that was just supposed to be this damning remark. It's some kind of 19th century thing. But I've seen a couple of Christians say the same thing, too. Well, we don't really use the democracy of the dead, as G.K. Chesterton called it, because we've just discovered some more things. And they're just flat wrong. Actually, what we've done is we've lost touch with some of these really good ways of evaluating the historicity of documents rather than actually gaining some brand new discovery that makes those obsolete.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the approach of New Testament scholars currently. Some of them, whether they're believers or not, it seems to me they have a more stringent, skeptical approach to the Gospels. And in a way, it seems that they sort of like sift through various reports and sayings in the Gospels, and they determine one by one, piecemeal, whether they think certain bits and pieces are more or less factual based upon whatever historical filters or presuppositions they might bring to it. So how would you describe this sort of approach? This is more factual, this is less historical. And do you think it's a good way of actually getting at the truth?
Well, there wouldn't necessarily be anything wrong with saying, the way I like to phrase it, this is especially unlikely to be made up. So sometimes with those, they're called criteria of authenticity. Like the criterion of embarrassment, it would be embarrassing to have women discover the tomb because women were kind of looked down upon as witnesses, etc. If you just said about that, and this is a reason why this is especially unlikely to be made up, that would be true, as far as it goes. The problem that arises is when you're locked into those tools, you don't have other tools. You tend to say, at the best, well, if it doesn't satisfy this criterion or some criterion of authenticity in this list here, we can't know. A stronger view would be among the more skeptical scholars that it didn't happen. But even a milder view, I think it's also misguided to say, well, historians then can't know. There's not a historical argument for it. We could only know it as Christians or something like that. And I think that's wrong. And so what I've argued for is what I've called a holistic approach to reliability. Again, it's making common sense rigorous. It's what we do with our friends all the time or people that we know, even our auto mechanics. If that person gets it right and we check him over and over again, then when he makes some new statement, we don't necessarily have to check that new statement. We can say, well, I have reason to trust this source, and I don't have any reason against this particular news statement. There could be some special reason to doubt it, but if there isn't any special reason to doubt it, then, his saying it becomes a pretty strong prima facie case that it's true. And so I think we should take that same approach to the Gospels, and especially when it comes to non-miraculous statements. I could see, miracles, okay, got to have a somewhat higher threshold or epistemic bar or something. But if it's a saying of Jesus, no problem. It's somebody saying something, and if this was written by a person who had access to Jesus' ministry, maybe he was a disciple himself, then if he remembers Jesus saying this, why not? There's no real reason to doubt it. And so that's a very different approach from the criteriological approach. And it's viewed with shock. I mean, that there are Christians who have so internalized that criteriological approach that they'll say, well, I can know that as a Christian, but I don't have a good historical argument for that I could give to an unbeliever. And it's like, well, why not? Well, because it doesn't satisfy any of the criteria of authenticity. So as a historian, I would have to be agnostic about it. And I do think that's a misguided way to approach it.
Is that historically how Christians have defended the Gospels, or is that relatively speaking, I guess would be the correct word, a more recent phenomenon?
It's not all that recent. It's an offshoot of the quest for the historical Jesus. Mm-hmm. How recent? So, first quest, second quest, third quest, So, how recent are we talking here, right?
Yeah.
In a sense, apologetics as a big thing has grown up in the late 20th century and even more so here in the early 21st century. So you could almost say that the apologetics cottage industry is more recent than the criteria of authenticity, depending on how you look at it. And it was sort of born into a world, the big boom in apologetics was sort of born into an intellectual world in which the criteriological approach to the Gospels was already well established.
So you've touched on this a bit already, but talk to us more about kind of what the cumulative case approach to defending the Gospels is and why that is important, or even maybe the most useful way to go about defending the Gospels.
Probably everything that any of us now believe that is not deductive. So we're not talking about mathematics or something.
Sure.
History, what stores we like to shop at, what restaurants are good, what we know about our friends, all of those things are based on cumulative cases. We may not think of it in those terms, but cumulative cases are absolutely, I would say, everywhere. They're ubiquitous. And so there's every reason to apply it to the Gospels. And what you end up seeing is that it's really over-justified. So many of the things we believe are over-justified. If somebody asked you, how do you know that Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation and freed the slaves? If you dig back into that, you're going to find you've got even more evidence than, in a sense, what you strictly need. And from all these different, vectors, right? Letters, different varied history books, original source documents, etc. And what that does is it creates a safety net rather than a single-stranded rope. So, sometimes people will say about evidentialist apologetics, oh, you're just one premise away from losing your faith. And that's completely false. It's quite to the contrary. It's this very tough interwoven net. So that even if you find out, oh, that letter was forged or something, you lose one premise. If you've got over-justification, then you're like, oh, well, that's unfortunate, but you've still got a lot of other evidence. And I think when we approach the Gospels that way, we really find this embarrassment of riches. But we have to first open ourselves up to the possibility that they're really justified in this way, that they're really over-justified, really highly reliable. And I find that laymen are often very open to that, especially if they're already Christians. You could say, well, they're sort of biased, but it's that the scholars are sometimes almost unable to conceive of it that way. And you find yourself sort of walking them through and saying, well, look, if your best friend tells you something, do you go check it out case by case every single time? Okay, well, the Gospel of Luke is like that. We find out what this guy was like as a writer, what his approach to truth was, that he was scrupulous and that kind of thing. And it's like a whole new thought to them, and takes a while for it to really sink in. But I think that is really justified. That's a justified approach, even though unpopular.
Yeah, interesting. A moment ago, I said, you can read the Gospels and you could say they have the ring of truth. But then it's sort of another thing to say, why does this have the ring of truth? What does it mean to have the ring of truth? And so in your book, each chapter takes a common sense approach, gives you various evidence for the truth and makes it plain and visible. And it to my mind, it's like, okay, well, the best explanation for it being this way is that, they were intending to give truthful testimony of actual historical events over and against the idea that either they're forgeries or concoctions or they have some plan to write some theological message. So my question is basically along this line. When we're reading the Gospels, does it help us to look at it like this, where we say, does it make more sense to think it's fictional or corrupted or that it's historical? Because, if you're searching for the inference to the best explanation, so to speak, should you be like comparing that in your head? Is that a sort of an approach that helps us to assess the overall truthfulness of it?
I think it is, but I think it needs to be done in a sort of a guided way. And I find that sometimes when people try to assess that, they are going for possibility rather than probability. So someone a few months ago wrote to me about the book of Acts, and he had heard about the claim that there were libraries in the ancient world. And he said, well, I have friends who are telling me that the author of Acts could have just gone and looked all these facts up in a library somewhere. So it was, and that's how he could have had these things that are accurate, the geography and the customs of the time. And of course, there's a lot of those in the Gospels as well. And he just needed to have it explained that library doesn't mean what he thinks it means, There's no Encyclopedia Britannica. There's no Google. So, instead of reaching, you would have to be reading through an entire scroll, for one thing. It can't even be indexed because it's a scroll, and happen upon something and then go, oh, I'm going to make a note of that, and then go and put it into the book of Acts. So in order for a person to evaluate that comparative hypothesis thing that you were talking about there, Brian, sometimes the person does need some additional information about the ancient world or about what is really probable or improbable, because they'll reach for bare possibilities. Like, isn't it just barely possible that this person was, inventing modern hyper-realistic fiction 1,500, 1,800 years early or whatever, and then this genius sort of dropped out of sight, and you have to sort of spell that out. If they bring that up, like, what would this really involve? Let's get clear on just how far-fetched that alternative hypothesis really is. So, yes, you want to do that comparative thinking, but you need to do it in a way that is A, well-informed, and B, thinking about comparative probabilities, not just about the bare possibility of something happening on the skeptical side.
Well, I'm thinking of something, let me try to think of an example. Well, I mean, there's a lot of little details that you mention in the book, little seemingly insignificant details, say, that Luke gives. Even if you went into Acts too, and you're talking about, well, the depth of the water and stuff, they took soundings and it was this deep. In my mind, I'm thinking, okay, I have a couple options. He put that in there to make it sound realistic, or he put it in there because that's just what happened. And so that's the sort of thinking I'm sort of alluding to, is that why would someone go to that extent to find out the truth of that? Or he'd have to be, it just sort of strains my
credulity.
Yeah, that's the word. It strains credulity to say that, he went to that extent for a small detail that requires a lot of work to get accurate. Whereas if you were there, it would be a no-brainer. You would just remember it.
Right. Or you would have to actually go to that place, So, for example, when John says that the pool of Bethesda has 5 porches, right? And then it was destroyed in the destruction of Jerusalem, So, interestingly, Bart Ehrman has said something that's just completely wrong. He has said that if an author of the Gospels or Acts gets a fact right, that is of no evidential value in showing that the document is true or that the story is true.
That.
But if the person gets it wrong, that refutes its truth. And I mean, that's like impossible.
You can't win.
You can actually show the math. You can't do it that way, I mean, there can be asymmetries as far as the force. If anything, the asymmetry here, I think, goes in the opposite direction. It's harder to get it right than it is to get it wrong. But no, of course, he is going to jump on something that is incorrect. And so in that sense, that's the skeptic's unintended tribute to the importance of that. So what you find in the Gospels is that they're very deeply immersed in that pre-70 AD culture. They're in Jerusalem. They know the places. They know the burial customs. They know the way that the Roman government interacts with the local Jewish government, the fact that there are multiple systems of taxation. All that stuff, they just know, and it just comes out of them in this very casual sort of way. So if it's invented, you have to have someone to start with who knows all that stuff, because you can't go look it up, who lived at that time, and then is just somehow, bringing it all in this very hoax-like sort of way to make a story that is untrue. And as you say, Brian, that strains credulity.
Yeah, I think, too, one of the things I think about because we talked about this last time we had you on about the reportage model. One of the things I always think about is where the burden of proof would fall. So what I mean by this is, see if I can sketch an analogy out here, is, and you can, tell me if it works or not. I've read a lot of scientists and biologists and such, like they'll agree that nature, for example, looks designed. Like there's an appearance of design. Right. But then, of course, they try to explain this appearance of design through natural means. Well, to me, because then I think the burden of proof would rightfully fall on them, because if we're all agreeing there's an appearance of design, well, then it's your job to just, explain how it's not design, not mine, because we all agree it has this appearance. And it seems like the most logical inference is a designer. Well, in the same way, when I'm looking at the Gospels and I'm reading the Gospels, I mean, most people who are going to read them, I think are going to, and, my hunch is that they would agree that it is a type of reportage. I mean, it seems to me that these people are trying to communicate what they believe happened and what they believe, they saw. And so if there's an appearance of reportage, if you will, then to me, then we should take it that way until there's reason to believe otherwise.
I think the way that a skeptic approaches that, of course, is to say, no, it's not an appearance of reportage because it has miracles in it. So like if you're a non-Christian, you're going to say, nah, that doesn't appear to be real. That looks made up. Why? Well, because they say, Jesus is going around performing all these miracles. So, a skeptic may bring in a very overt anti-supernatural bias to that, and then try to deny that it looks like reportage. But I find that skeptics and Christians alike sometimes lack a sense for the texture of witness testimony. So you'll get these very offhand analogies that are very poor. So, for example, there was an ancient oratory teacher named Quintilian, and he wrote a document on, how to be a good lawyer, how to be a good orator. And I've seen the analogy made, well, the Gospels contain a lot of these little vivid details. Well, that could be just like what Quintilian told them to do. Well, when you actually go and read what Quintilian wrote, it doesn't sound like that at all, because he's telling them to be very over the top, because he's training them to be lawyers, right? So if you want to get the judge to condemn the criminal, then you tell this story like, imagine how the victim screamed and how he begged for mercy and how the blood flowed. And, it's just like this very, very gory, romantic, purple thing. And it's like, compare that to the Gospels. Even when a miracle does occur, it's very, Jesus says, hold out your hand. And then the hand is made the way it was before. Notice like when Jesus appears to the disciples after his resurrection, he's not glowing or anything, and so there's this kind of restraint there that is completely different when Jesus is going to raise Lazarus from the dead, it says he was moved within himself. It's how some translations translate it. It's the noise that a horse makes when snorting. So we don't know why he made this funny noise, but he's just like, and, like before he goes to call Lazarus to come out. That's not like what Quintilian's telling them to do at all. So I sometimes find that what we have to do is we have to strip away those layers of faulty analogy, and we have to bring the person face to face. We have to say, no, go talk to, I don't know, a Gulf War veteran. Get him to tell you, his sort of living history. Get him to tell you his stories about what it was like to be there and what kind of funny things happen on a day-to-day basis. Read Holocaust memoirs or whatever. Listen. Just listen to your friends when they're sitting around at a party and they're like, did I tell you about the time that my husband, locked the keys in the car or whatever? And get a sense for what that sounds like. And then go read the Gospels and see the similarities. And then hopefully they will acknowledge that it has that appearance of reportage and that the simplest explanation is that it really is.
That's helpful.
There's a chapter in there about the unnecessary details and things. And we talked about a couple of those, just moments ago, like places and locations and things that you didn't have to say, but you happened to say. And back to what you're saying there, Lydia, about when someone is reporting what happened, one of the things you say in the book is that they're playing it back in their head. And so they just say what they're seeing, reporting it, not because it needs to be reported, those extra details, but because they're remembering it. I suppose one of the common sort of things you hear around the internet is something like, yeah, well, there's things like fiction where they try to make it realistic by adding in these details. So these extra details you see in the Gospels, well, that's just them trying to make it sound realistic. Where's that going wrong, Lydia?
Well, one of the things I talk about in the book is what I call gospel details in the Goldilocks zone. So, Goldilocks is the little girl, and she's eating the bear's porridge, and one bowl is too hot and another bowl is too cold, and one bowl is just right. So the Goldilocks zone is this zone that's just right. What we find is that the Gospel's use of details does not look like ancient fiction, and it does not look like modern fiction. It doesn't look like any kind of fiction. So ancient fiction was very over the top. Yes, there was ancient fiction. And it's so funny, I'll say there wasn't hyper-realistic ancient fiction. And sure enough, some internet skeptic will go, yeah, there was ancient fiction. It's like you left out hyper-realistic, I had that adjective in there for a reason,
That's an important distinction there.
Right. So there was a guy named Chariton who wrote a novel called Caliroe, and it's just this kind of a fun, romantic romp. But it's not hyper-realistic at all. Again, you've got to get a sense for that, but it's just, if they're going to describe a feast, it's going to be like the greatest feast ever or whatever. So it doesn't sound like ancient fiction because it's more realistic than that, but it doesn't sound like modern fiction either. So modern fiction, what you'll find if you pick up a really good modern fiction author, and I actually did this on one of my videos that I did, and I read it out loud, and I said, notice how she keeps the level of detail the same all the way through the scene. If she's going to say this person made this gesture with his hand or, he turned around or whatever, this is a very intense scene, she's not going to just suddenly drop that and go to generalizing in the same scene. Now go and compare that to John 21 when Jesus is meeting with his disciples. This is on the Sea of Galilee after he's risen from the dead. So you've got this weird little detail, very vivid, where Peter recognizes that it's Jesus and he puts his coat on before he jumps into the water rather than taking his coat off, which you would not usually do. I mean, you're going to swim. You don't want your outer garment on. We can conjecture why he did it. That's not the point, but it's just this very unusual, vivid little detail. But then later, when it's describing the scene over breakfast, it just says something like, this was the third time that Jesus appeared to his disciples. You know, it gives a dialogue, gives some dialogue there, and then it just kind of drops it. And it's like, man, you know, I want to know more. I want to know how much fish they ate. I want to know what expression was on Jesus' face. I want to know what they said to one another over breakfast. And wait, it says Jesus already had fish. Had he caught the fish first? You know, and did they ask him, hey, you know, we're the ones who caught the fish. Where did you get the fish? There's all kinds of questions that are left unanswered. A modern novelist would not do that. A modern hyper-realistic novelist would get everything well explained and would keep that level of detail consistent throughout. So the gospel unnecessary details are a lot more like memoir. I forget whom I was listening to recently. Oh, I know. It was a Zoom presentation that I was listening to, and I think it was John Loftus was present. He's a skeptic.
Oh,
and he
yes.
he said, these documents don't look like memoir. They're not like memoirs. And he said, you know, it's like if I turn on the television and I see a giant monster eating a city, eating Tokyo, then I know that the genre is fiction, right? And
Wow.
I said, no, they don't. They don't look like a giant monster eating Tokyo, you know. They actually do look like memoirs. And it's like that a person will remember one thing and then it'll be like, and then we got there. You know, he's not going to go on describing the whole trip or whatever. It's just what is salient, right? And I have this phrase I really want people to pick up on, the randomness of saliency. What is salient? Salient means to stand out. What is salient to you in a given event is going to be, to some extent, random. What springs out to you. So when the beloved disciple was there and Peter went to jump out in and go to Jesus, the fact that he put his garment on, that was just that random salient little thing that popped out. And I think we can recognize that quality in the Gospels, and that's why the could just be fiction. It's an overly quick, it's a shallow kind of evaluation of the actual quality of the documents.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and a great explanation of that, and a great example of that too. Obviously, I'd love to unpack all the different sort of, different categories of evidence that you sort of highlight, but let's talk about unexplained allusions. What are these? Can you give a few examples of how they show gospel reliability?
Yeah, I love unexplained allusions. I mean, it's an amazing category, and I have a feeling that I came upon it in one of those 19th century guys, but I'm not sure which one it was. I think it might have been T.R. Burks, and whoever it was didn't use that phrase. I coined that phrase, but he was getting at that same idea. So the sort of modern example I give in the chapter on this in Testimonies would be a mother who's talking about her day, and she had a rough day. She's got a child in school, and she says, and I was late for my ISP meeting. And then she just goes on, you know, and tells about how she got into a fender bender with her car. And if you've ever had a child in school in the United States, you know what an ISP meeting is. But if you haven't, you probably don't. So ISP is individual, I think it's individual study plan. So if you have a child with special needs, they will work out this, or individual service plan, I think that's what it is. They'll work out this plan, and there's, you know, a committee or a group of people or a coordinator that will help you, and then the parent will meet sometimes with that coordinator to make sure that it's working out and modify the plan if they need to modify it or whatever. But she's just trying to get to telling about the fender bender, right? So her eye is not fixed on her audience. It's a non-literary performance. She's just telling what happened. So it never occurs to her, oh, these people I'm speaking to, you know, they may be older than I am, or their kids are all homeschooled, or whatever. They don't know what an ISP is. I better pause and explain it. So she doesn't think of that, right? That's an unexplained allusion. And it's a mark of authenticity. It's a mark of truthfulness and genuineness in the person because the person is unself-conscious. Because it shows that unself-consciousness. You're busy getting where you're going in your story. You don't pause to put your eye on the audience and say, oh, I better not use that phrase. So what you're ending up with is unpolished. It's unstudied. It's natural. The older authors called it artless. It's artless, and that would also be a word for truthful, to be artless. So an example in the Gospel of Mark would be when he's giving a list of all the names of the 12 that Jesus chose. And he mentions James and John. He says Jesus called them Boanerges, which means the sons of thunder. That's it. And he just moves on, with his list. He doesn't give you an origin story, if you're gonna be writing, say, a television show, it would be very tempting, to pause at that point and say, for they were very loud, or, whatever, like to give an explanation. Why? Because one day, and some people have suggested that it might have been because of the incident where they suggested calling down fire on a Samaritan village. Maybe that was the reason, but Mark doesn't tell you that. He's just interested in telling you what their nickname was and moving on. So that would be an example of an unexplained allusion in Mark. An unexplained allusion in John would be, it says in chapter 3 at the beginning, the disciples of John the Baptist had a dispute with a Jew about purification. And they came to John, meaning John the Baptist, and they said, teacher, the man you testified to when you were baptizing, he is baptizing, and everyone is coming to him. So the disciples of John the Baptist have a complaint that Jesus is too popular, and then that leads right into John the Baptist saying, he must increase and I must decrease. What have we lost sight of in this story? The dispute, right? Mm-hmm. Like, we never learn who was this other person they were arguing with. Was he a follower of Jesus? Like, what was the connection between that and what they said to John the Baptist? It's not smooth. It's not literary at all. It's a loose end. So that when they come to John the Baptist, they've got a complaint, but the connection between the complaint and the dispute is left unclear. So that's a sign of artless narration. And so that's another unexplained allusion.
All of this looking at gospel reliability is ultimately to point us to Jesus, and you end the book focusing on Jesus, his character, his uniqueness. And I just wonder, when we are looking at Jesus, what aspects of his account, of his life, do you think bear strong witness that it's a reliable account?
I think it's those aspects that are simultaneously subtle and also similar. That's a really hard thing to get, because if somebody were inventing this, you would expect them maybe to tell the same story over again, or to sort of beat you over the head with it. So, if you watch a television show and it's about Adrian Monk, like that television show Monk, right? Yeah. He's got OCD. What we're doing there is we're playing it up, right? Like when he has to grab something that he thinks is germy, he's pulling his cuffs over his hands and he can't concentrate because of OCD, etc. It's very much being played up. It's not subtle at all. So it's similar between the episodes, but it's not subtle. But when we look at Jesus' portrayal in the Gospels, the similarities are subtle, and yet they're definitely there. So an example would be, I talk about sarcastic Jesus. So there you go. Jesus was sarcastic. You can be sarcastic too. I'm joking. Anyway, but that Jesus has a sort of edge to him, and it's this almost what you would almost call bitter humor. So in Luke, the leaders come to him, and I think they were sort of taunting him, and they say, "You had better leave this region, or Herod is going to get you. Herod's going to kill you." And Jesus says, "No, go tell that fox I'm going to travel on today and tomorrow, and then I'm going to reach my goal. For it cannot be that a prophet should perish outside of Jerusalem." Now that is bitter. I mean, you pause and think about that for a minute. Like, you could just hear the way he says that, hey, I'm a great prophet. Herod's not going to get me before I go to Jerusalem. All prophets die in Jerusalem, didn't you know? King Sing, And then compare that to the place in John where he said, I and the Father are one. They pick up stones. They're going to try to stone him. And he says, I've done many good works among you. For which of my good works are you stoning me? I mean, that he's just really zinging them, right?
Yeah.
It's very sarcastic and edgy. And then, of course, they don't have a sense of humor. They say, not for a good work, because you, being a man, made yourself equal to God, or similarly, when they come to get him in the garden, and he says, I was daily teaching in the temple. Why have you come out after me, as after a thief with clubs and torches? Well, of course he knows, and they know. They were afraid to arrest him in the temple, right? So he's pointing to their cowardice in this roundabout way. Or when he, in the woes to the Pharisees, he says, you build great tombs, and you say, if we had been alive in those days, we would never have shed the blood of the prophets. And of course, like right then, they are plotting to shed his blood. Right? But he's like pointing to, oh, no, of course, you would never shed the blood of a prophet. Now, notice these are all different. They're completely different stories. And yet, when you read them and when you start noticing it, you say, that is the same guy. Yeah. It is the same man. It's the same turn of mind. It's the same way of speech. It's that same edge that he has to him. But they're all across all the different Gospels, subtle and yet strong indicators of the same personality. And I've got a lot more of them in Testimonies to the Truth in that last chapter.
Yeah, and I love Jesus' style. For example, like when he says, I've always wondered this, when he says it's easier to get a camel through the eye of a needle than it is to get a rich man into heaven. I've always wondered, was there laughter there? Because that's so absurd, that I always wonder that.
Yeah, he does. He has this very rabbinic style. And what's cool about that is I call it, witty Jesus. That's the section header, where I talk about that. And you could just say, well, okay, somebody knows about the way rabbis talk, but it's a little more than even just the way that rabbis like to talk. They did like to be vivid like that and be witty, but he specifically uses it to point up a certain kind of hypocrisy or a lack of a sense of perspective. So he talks in those same woes to the Pharisees. He said, you tithe mint and dill and cumin. And by the way, we have independent confirmation that they did tithe herbs like that. So that's one of those confirmed details. But then he says, and you've neglected the weightier matters of the law, mercy and justice. So what's the contrast? Light and heavy, right? The herbs are light. Imagine trying to tithe, these little seeds, these little tiny things, one seed, one dill seed, two dill seed, three dill seed. Okay, I got to put aside 1/10 of them, but neglecting the heavier matters. Similarly, when you go to the story of the woman who had been bent over for 18 years, the ruler of the synagogue tells the people, don't come to be healed on the Sabbath. There are 6 other days you could come to be healed on. It's like, instead of being impressed that Jesus has just performed miraculous healing, he's chiding them about coming to be healed on the Sabbath. And Jesus says, you will untie your animal to take it to water on the Sabbath. That's permitted. But you don't want me to untie or to loose this woman whom Satan has bound for 18 years. So that's that same mindset as the light and heavy. Here it's untying an animal is allowed, but untying a woman is not allowed. And he's using both of them to point to their misguided or their skewed rules. And there are more examples of the same kind. So that style that Jesus has, again, you look at it and you say, same man. It's the same man over and over and over again.
It's a great book, and it's one of those ones where not only does it educate you and cause you to think, but it just makes you appreciate the scriptures and see all these new things that you didn't see before, but it's always been there. And so, you could read the Gospels afresh and anew and see all these things pop out at you. So For those listening, this book will strengthen your faith, help you to defend the reliability of the Gospels and understand all those things that make them so unique. But also, I think it would strengthen your faith. And when you read through the Gospels again, all these things will start to pop out even more. So, Lydia, our time has flown, and it's been a very enjoyable conversation. Thank you so much for being with us again.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Chad. And I hope that we can do it again sometime.
Yes, that'd be great.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast, and we also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice, and please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.